For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And tonight I'm very excited to welcome my friend Hamada to the scene. Hamada, how you doing?
Good, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. So do you want to share a little bit about your background and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Hamada Zahawi, as Steve said. I am an attorney. I've been practicing law on and off for the last 11 years. I started Right Track Admissions in 2008, and Right Track Admissions is a global admissions consulting company. We focus on college admissions and law admissions as well as MBA, but our mainstay and the one that we've done the longest and are most proud of in terms of a track record is our law school admissions, which really comprises of each and every aspect of the law school admissions process, from the personal statement, diversity statement, advising on letters of recommendation, addendum, and resume.
Fantastic. And I'm really excited to bring your expertise to everyone. And so I was thinking that given all the recent changes this year with the digital LSAT and other LSAC policy changes, we could kind of do a two-parter tonight focusing on both LSAT and admissions, especially since the November LSAT was actually today. And I've been fielding questions all day about cancellations, retakes, things of that nature. So I thought we might cover that a little bit.
Fantastic. More than happy to do that. Should we kick it off with some LSAT questions in terms of just kind of getting that out of the way, especially since people are, as you said, just got the exam under their belt and now want to make kind of decisions as they go forward?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so let's take it a step back. When do you recommend that people actually take the LSAT now that the LSAT is now offered 8 times a year?
Yeah, so it used to be 4 times a year. Now it's unclear exactly how many times it'll be, but I think it's as many as 10 actually. So that raises the question, well, you could really take it virtually anytime. And my biggest recommendation would be not a particular month, since the LSAT is equated. It's really more about when you're most ready to take it, but also considering the admissions timeline, which we'll get into. Applying earlier is typically better. So if let's say if you're a junior in college right now, you could take the LSAT in the spring semester of your junior year, and then retake it again in the summer or fall if you need to, still letting you apply at the very beginning of the cycle. So earlier is better.
So here's what I heard. We just had a recent client, and here is her conundrum. She had taken the LSAT, I believe, in September, received her score, took the LSAT again in October. Took the LSAT in September, canceled her score, took the LSAT in October, received her score, and had already lined up to take the LSAT in November. But then didn't feel very good about taking in November, so she said, maybe I'll take it in January. So it's a 2-part question. The first part is, how do you advise people to take the LSAT in January if they plan to apply for that coming year? So in this case, for fall 2020. The second part of the question is, from our research, we discovered that you can only take the LSAT 3 times in an admission cycle. An admission cycle would essentially be March until March. So what do you recommend people do in such a scenario?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, January LSAT, in my mind, is the absolute latest I would recommend taking it. I think any later than that, as you would agree, chances decline, available scholarship money declines as well. So January is the absolute latest I would suggest. It's preferable to be done by the end of the calendar year, which in this case is today's LSAT in November, of course. As for the retake limit, you're right about that. It is 3 times in one cycle. This is a very recent policy change from LSAC. It used to be 3 times in a 2-year period. Then they removed the limits altogether to as many times as you want. Then this summer, they changed it back to 3 times in one cycle. My understanding was the cycle runs from June to May of the following year, but we should probably give folks the link on that if they want to find out more. But ultimately, I think retaking is typically a good idea. I'm glad your client did both September and October at least, because, hey, through luck alone, you could do a few points better. And then if you study on top of that, you could do even more so. I mean, there's a 3-point margin of error on either end, or a score band. So if you deserved a 160, you might get a 163. So not much downside, especially since law schools don't average multiple scores and they only take the highest.
So now you've got students who are, as you mentioned, juniors are getting ready to start taking the LSAT. Where do you recommend they start, and what materials do you recommend they take on?
So I would suggest, of course, getting actual official LSAT prep tests published by the Law School Admission Council. They're available in books of 10 exams for about $20 each. A lot of folks like to start off with a diagnostic, and I understand why. There's a certain value to that, especially as a baseline measurement for later to show your improvement. But ultimately, it's going to be pretty bad. It's going to be much lower than you want it to be typically because, let's face it, you've never studied anything like this before. So, of course, it's not going to go well. It's like if you were learning a foreign language and took a diagnostic in that when you hadn't studied it all yet, it would go poorly. So take a diagnostic or not, it's up to you. But ultimately, you've got to go through the same process where you learn the basics of the exam, specifically the different section types and the different question types. Don't just jump in and do exam after exam. I want you to build a foundation first.
So just to kind of piggyback on that, let's say you score a 142, 143 versus the person who takes it for the first time in a diagnostics and scores like a 160, 161. Do you recommend both do, I mean, what type of materials do you recommend to them? And do you recommend test prep for the person that's done the 143 and the person that's done the 163?
I'd recommend test prep to either group, to anyone really, because no matter what your baseline is, unless you got a 180, there's room for improvement. The person in the low 140s, they obviously need a much more comprehensive foundation to be built for themselves in order to improve more significantly. The person starting in the 160s might need more targeted prep, perhaps on a particular area. Now, as far as what materials to get, aside from the actual exams, I offer test prep. So of course, I'm going to mention my own stuff. I have a variety of books, including guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, full video courses for every section, including on-demand video lessons, as well as live classes and group coaching as well. And so those could really help either group. I think the person who's scoring higher would benefit from more targeted, smaller group or one-on-one coaching. The person scoring on the lower end would probably benefit from a more comprehensive course covering all sections of the exam.
So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive. If you can see, and from all your experience, you're providing video, you're providing on-demand video, you're providing materials like written materials in 2-dimension, or I guess 1-dimension. You provide tutoring, private tutoring, I assume as well, in terms of the stuff you're providing. Who do you think, or which type of student would excel better with video versus on paper versus private tutoring? Like, who's going to be the person that really will benefit from somebody walking them through it versus them doing it on their own versus them doing it on their own on video versus them doing it on paper?
That's a great question.
In terms of types of people that you've seen. So that way, the people that are listening and so forth can say, you know what? I'm that kind of person that's much more auditory or much more visual, and this will probably benefit me more, which is why it's great that you're providing a whole gamut of different opportunities for different people to study.
Thanks for that. I think it's a great question. I actually don't get asked that one a lot. I think that as for video versus written, it's not for me to say which is better. I think they each have their benefits. Some find video more engaging. Some learn better out of a book. The LSAT is, of course, a written exam, not a video exam, but some people find video more engaging. And so I'd say use the free materials first. I have a very comprehensive YouTube channel covering everything LSAT and admissions. I also have over 1,000 articles on my website, the LSAT blog. And so read some of the articles, watch some of the videos, decide what you like better. And hey, if you have a commute, podcasts are always easy and a good way to passively absorb information while you're on the road. As for one-on-one coaching specifically, though, that's where I would go a little bit in a different direction. That is for a very specific kind of student, in particular, the highly motivated student, because there's something different about one-on-one coaching where it actually requires a lot from the student. I mean, I could have someone come to me and say, teach me the entire curriculum from start to finish. And theoretically, I could do that, but that's not efficient. I'd rather have a student who's highly motivated, studies a lot on their own, and brings me their biggest questions to each session where they're ready to go.
And that's a really important point about the kind of student that that requires that kind of discipline to do it on their own versus the ones that really kind of need that coaching. Let me ask you this then. Let's make a little bit of a shift over to the digital LSAT. I got a question asked. I was recently at a prelaw society at UCLA speaking with students there. One student asked me, she said, now that the LSAT exam is digital, should we be studying and reading more materials online versus on paper? Because previously, obviously, it was on paper. So there's an adjustment period that's required between reading something consistently and continuously for 35 minutes with a short break, 35 minutes with a short break, versus on paper where we've become very accustomed to doing over, at least in the last X amount of years. So do you recommend students actually do more reading and build up their reading stamina on articles online, or do you still say kind of like, change it up?
Yeah, I would say definitely do more reading on a screen. We're used to reading relatively lower quality materials online, like listicles and stuff, and then reading more dense material on paper. But the LSAT is digital and it's incredibly dense and complex material. So I would suggest doing a lot of LSAT exams on the screen. There are a couple on LSAC's site at familiar.lsac.org. Then if you have the PDFs, you could always load those onto your computer or onto a tablet, so you're reading them on screen. And if you want more, you could obviously read The Economist or Scientific American or any academic journal article on a screen just to get used to reading more difficult material there. That being said, though, of course, the vast majority of LSAT exams are only available in books unless you have the PDFs. And so if you want to treat your books like a screen in that you don't write on them at all and you do all your work on scratch paper to the side, that would be a decent substitute.
So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on the digital LSAT itself. How do you recommend, other than what you're talking about, just to make your LSAT preps potentially? Is there anything else that students should be doing that would help them better prepare for the digital aspect of the LSAT now?
Well, I'd get a tablet if you can. LSAC is using a Microsoft Surface Go 10-inch tablet, but you don't have to get that one in particular. Any tablet will be fine. A Samsung, an iPad, an Amazon Fire, and they're on sale for Black Friday for like $100. That's not a bad investment. And Amazon has a liberal return policy too, so you could always return it afterwards. But loading some PDFs onto the tablet or using LSAC's site on the tablet, I think, is really the best way to prepare. The format is only the only thing that's changed. The content itself has not changed at all. So I wouldn't want to overemphasize the importance of preparing in the digital format. But at the same time, I've totally redesigned my LSAT courses for the digital LSAT, considering that there are certain changes, like there's a countdown clock on this tablet and you can only see one question at a time. You can't draw on the questions. And so those are some minor adjustments that I think are important to at least be aware of before walking in.
When was the first digital LSAT? I believe it was in October, right?
The first digital LSAT, they did some pilots last year and then early this year. The first widespread administration of it was in July, where half the students got paper, half got digital. And then it was fully digital starting with the September LSAT.
What were some of the issues that people ran into? What are the bugs that they had to kind of work through on that you may have heard of?
Yeah, sure. There's unfortunately a lot, and I hope it's getting better and better each administration, which is what seems to be the case. The biggest thing that would affect students now still is the styluses don't always work. So don't expect the stylus to work and use your pen, use your finger instead, ultimately, and use your scratch paper to the side because you can at least trust that. The other thing is that the tablets, they get some overhead glare from fluorescent lighting above. And so when you walk in, you find there's glare on your screen and it's hard to read, ask to be moved before the test actually starts. Those are the two things you can really control. Aside from that, there have been a variety of malfunctions on LSAC's part with tablets not being charged before they arrive to the test center, tablets never showing up, tablets glitching in various ways. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that as a student. You just have to walk in hoping for the best, but being prepared for the worst, just with your expectations set accordingly. That's another reason why it's good to take the LSAT earlier than you actually need to so that you can retake it if something does go wrong.
And so what about the new digital LSAT writing style and that kind of system?
Yeah, so that's actually not as bad, not as big a deal, because it's not at the test center itself. You're now able to do it on your own after the exam up to 1 year later. And so you don't have to do it on the test day anymore. You're doing it at home from your own computer. They're monitoring you with a webcam and a microphone for security purposes, but the stakes aren't that high because it's not a scored portion of the exam, and you could redo it if you need to. Not that they won't have the previous one, but you can always redo it if something went wrong, and you could write an addendum explaining it if you wanted to.
Okay, and the last one, just kind of some of that point. What about the LSAT retake policy? There's some more information on that, and how should people prepare for that?
So the new retake policy is 3 times in one admission cycle, which is from June to May. It's 5 times in a 5-year period, 7 times for life, and if you get a 180, you can't take it again. And LSAC says this change affects fewer than 1% of test takers. And I believe that. Honestly, most people aren't taking it 4 times in a 12-month period anyway, so not a huge deal. And it's really just because LSAC is they're used to producing 3 new test forms per year that they release. And now with 10 LSATs a year, they have to reuse a lot of old test forms that were previously unreleased. And so they want to minimize the number of people who are going to see the same test form twice, which would obviously be incredibly unfair. So like in one case, they would administer that exam overseas. The next time they do it as a Sabbath Observers Administration. The following time they use it in the case of inclement weather, where they have to postpone the LSAT for a certain group of people. And then finally, they administer it to the general population. And so that's the reason for this retake policy. So you just want to think a little bit strategically, just that you don't want to take the LSAT just to see how you'll do. You don't want to retake it just because. You want to have a certain conscious decision-making behind what you're doing here.
What are you going to do, Steve? You keep taking it and you get 180s, man. You're gonna be able to have to stop doing that now.
Yeah, I got to take them from the comfort of my own home without it counting, unfortunately, which is a blow to the ego, but what can you do?
And I guess last but not least, I mean, in terms of my background, I took the LSAT in December of 2002. Then I took it again in June of 2003, and then I took it again in December of 2003. And unlike Steve, for the audience members, my bane of my existence was the LSAT. I took it all those times. I actually canceled my first score, got my second score. It was actually a 155, and then I got the third score was a 153 when I took it in December and got the score in January. So from my end, it was literally a nightmare. And that from coming from a guy who took the bar exam and passed it on the first go in California and became a practicing attorney. So there are certain people that really take to the LSAT like it's the Matrix. I always thought about it. It's kind of almost like a pattern that you have to think about. And there is certain logic to it, but it's not one of those things you can cram. It's not one of those things that you can memorize. It really comes into practice, practice, practice. The same could be said for the bar, but the bar does take certain kind of analytical skills that does come from the studying that you're doing and from the years of law school that you had. When I was sitting there and deciding what I want, what to choose, I ended up just kind of beating a dead horse, as they would say, and practicing what Einstein said was insanity. Because I took test masters 3 times. Each time, I think I was doing it more because of an insecurity, I would say, a lack of confidence, and just feeling like I couldn't do it on my own. So suffice it to say, what Steve seems to be offering his group of people, which is fantastic, is all these different mechanisms. One of the questions that I did say in the beginning, but I kind of really want to throw it back in your lap again, Steve, because I think this is very, very important for those who are going to start feeling overwhelmed. You talked about podcasts, you talked about videos, you talked about blog articles, you talked about practice tests that are free online. If I'm coming at you and I am stressing out and I don't know where to start, either because I've taken the diagnostic and like you said, I bombed it and I'm really worried about where should I start, or I've taken the LSAT and I've really screwed it up and now I don't know where to kind of go from there. And in some exams, we don't get to see the past exam. So we can't see which section we're really doing bad in, except where we think, based on the diagnostics, we're really poor in either reading comp or logical reasoning and so forth. So given the suite of stuff that you provide your clients and people that are going to come onto your website and take a look at the stuff you offer, where would you say is a starting point that they can then say, I got it. I'm taking rides home. I got the podcast going on, but I'm just going to do these 2 videos, these couple of questions, and that should be the starting point, as opposed to like a whole plethora of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I think most people approaching the exam for the first time, they're going to have a lot of trouble with logic games. So I typically recommend start with logic games. They're the most intimidating, the most unfamiliar. No one's ever done anything like that before, except for a few people who went to like a nerdy math camp or something. So you start with the simplest of the simple logic games, the relative sequencing or basic linear, whatever you want to call them, just ordering games that relate, putting variables in a sequence. So in my study plans, you start with the easiest of the easy ordering games, move on to the moderate difficulty, then the most difficult, then easy grouping, moderate grouping, difficult grouping, and so on. So in my study plans, that's the guiding principle. I have a 5-step approach I call the laser approach to LSAT studying, which is learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Most people jump right to the exams, which is the 4th part, when they should start with the L for learning. That's the basics, reading textbook chapters, watching videos, getting a general sense of what the LSAT tests. Then A is for accuracy, doing individual questions by type from easy to difficult. Then S is for sections, doing individual 35-minute timed sections to work on your pacing. E is for exams and endurance, doing those full-length 5-section exams. And R is for review. most people do nothing but exams and they skip the other 4 parts. So that's the logical progression to build a basic understanding of each question type before you get into the full-length exams. So I'd start with easy ordering games if you were going from scratch.
And I know that, at least for me, sometimes you kind of feel like, the typical bicycle with the training wheels. When do you take the training wheels off and say, okay, I've learned enough so that I can start doing it? I assume you put together a whole, again, when we did test masters, they were diagnostics that came at different sequences after they've taught a ton of learning. Then they give you a diagnostic, a little less learning, and a diagnostic, then a diagnostic, and a diagnostic, and then you got into the exam. I assume, what kind of scheduling do you provide so that people can finally take off the training wheels and go from L to A, then A to S, and S to E, and then R?
Yeah, exactly. So the first thing I give all my students is a roadmap, a detailed plan of attack, so that step by step, day by day, you know exactly what to do. And that laser approach is the underlying principle behind these study plans. So there are diagnostic tests scattered throughout. I tend to put them a little bit later in the plan because folks typically find diagnostics pretty discouraging at the beginning, and everyone does need to learn the same thing. And also, the roadmaps are simply a general framework. Each student will have to adapt them to their own situation. These are day-by-day plans. And so I'll say, take off day 5 and study day 6. But if you're busy on day 6, flip it around, whatever works for you. Similarly, if someone is better at logical reasoning, but worse at reading comp, they might want to take 1 week from the logical reasoning portion and devote it to reading comprehension instead. So there's always going to be some adaptation involved, but I want students building the foundation before they start burning through practice material.
Fantastic. Okay, that's my questions for the LSAT.
Awesome. Those were great questions, and there were a lot I hadn't gotten before. So I'm excited to get into admissions with you. So first off, when should students start thinking about their applications and putting that side of things together?
A couple of things. I don't want to be alarmist, but you should be thinking about your application, especially if you're thinking about going to law school, as early as you possibly can. And what I mean by that is not just actually putting pen to paper for the purpose of drafting a personal statement, but I mean you're designing your story as we speak. If you're a junior, if you're a sophomore, your story today is actually going to be the story you're going to write about in 2 years. It's almost like a Twilight Zone situation. So if something happens to you tomorrow or the day after or 6 months from now, those are things you want to write down and keep it written down in some kind of journal of sorts, so that when you actually sit down and start writing your application, you can kind of reach over and start pulling out experiences and examples that you can actually feed into what your personal statement will start to look like. So that's on the one hand. But if you were to say, when should I actually start? Obviously, depending on, so let's take a hypothetical individual who is now a rising senior. You want to start thinking about your personal statements and your application, the schools you're thinking about applying to, and so forth, as early as the summer before your senior year. And that's probably the earliest. And then you really want to start putting pen to paper, and the way you want to start thinking about it is the brainstorming, kind of thinking of just throwing a bunch of ideas on a piece of paper, seeing how they kind of incongruently fit, how it goes into a personal statement format, which we can talk more about. And you want to basically have a draft ready to rock and roll, I would say, by September, so that you can start sharing that with your recommenders as soon as possible, so that they have a better idea of not just who you are, but why you actually want to go to law school. And then basically finalize that personal statement sometime in the end of October, beginning of November, and start firing them off to the schools. If there is a hard imaginary deadline, I would say that would be Thanksgiving, because after Thanksgiving, there's a deluge of applications coming through, so that if you do not have your application submitted by Thanksgiving, or the latest by the first or second week of December, you're really going to be thrown behind the pile, because people are going to go on vacation. And in the end of the day, your application is not going to be processed effectively until well into January, which by then, as you had mentioned earlier, you're losing scholarship money, but more importantly, a lot of the seats in the top law schools are already being taken.
That's a great answer. Thanks for that. So can you speak more about rolling admissions and what exactly happens? Some folks took the November LSAT today. Maybe it went well, maybe it didn't. They're going to take the January one and apply after that. What happens if someone takes anything after January, like if they take it in February or March?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, because the January test is on the 13th of January, correct?
It is, correct.
And you get the score within 2 to 3 weeks?
Typically, yes. So
that looks like you're not going to find out your score, which means they can't go into the next step of the process until sometime in February. If there was a percentage scale in terms of rolling admission, as you would say, we've had and worked with clients who've applied in October with, let's say, a mediocre LSAT score. Let's just say it's a 162 or something like that, a decent score, nothing off the charts, with a GPA that's a 3.6, and they applied in October. We had the same applicant apply with a 167 with close to a 3.8 somewhere at the end of December, January. That second applicant did not get in, the first one did, because what happens is there's a certain number of spaces in those schools that those spaces start getting taken up immediately and very, very quickly. And the school doesn't have a requirement where, like in an MBA application cycle, they have a strict deadline for the beginning of the rounds of admission, and that's when they start reviewing the applications, and then they start filling up the class. Here, the applications start sometime in September. They start taking in applications all the way through to March. Some people, God knows why, I really think that if they submit it before the hard deadline, and there is a hard deadline, but that deadline is not really a deadline. It's just literally a point where they say administratively, we've got to stop taking in applicants sometime in March and April. Those guys are never going to get in. Even if you had a 160, 177, you're not going to get in. There's no point. You're just doing yourself a disservice. So as I said, the sweet spot is really from October till like mid-November, end of November is when you really want to have those applicants in, because you give yourself the best chances of admission.
That makes a lot of sense. And is there a certain point at which it's too late to apply, in which case you would say to folks, you're better off just waiting till the next cycle?
I mean, traditionally, back in the day, you were taking the LSAT in December, you're still okay, right? You were taking the LSAT in the first week of December, you got the score pretty much at the end of December, beginning of January, you were still okay. Now, obviously, that's changed into January, so maybe the target of the whole school cycle is moved. Since there is no test date in December, now there was in January, maybe schools are becoming a little bit more flexible. Personally, I tell my clients, if you plan to take the LSAT in January, you almost forget about getting in, because by February, the classes are going to be full. And if you're already kind of like an in-between, on-the-fence candidate, I would really say it's not going to happen. And that's where you kind of, as you just alluded to, you might as well just kind of hold on, don't take the January test date. If you're planning to take it, don't take it, and just take it in like a later date, like March or June. Study for it properly, go through the motions, use Steve's stuff, all the gamut of all the stuff that you guys have out there, all the optionality, and then get a solid score in June, and then start writing your application over the summer and get it out as soon as possible in September. I, for example, took 2 years out before I went into law school. So I graduated at 22 from UCLA, and I took 2 years before I matriculated to UC Berkeley Law School when I was 24. I still graduated when I was 29 because I also took a year out to do a master's in the middle of it, and I was fine. It wasn't the end of the world.
I really like that you're encouraging students to take the time to slow down and do it right, because it can seem frustrating in the moment, but keep in mind, especially if someone's in college, they're 21, 22 years old, you still have your entire career ahead of you. What does it really matter at the end of the day, long-term, if you take another year or two to get it done right?
I agree. And in fact, we just had another client who inquired, and she was scoring in the 167, 168 range. And I'm not even kidding. I don't even know what the hell happened, but she ended up with a 151 or 152.
Oh, wow.
Which is crazy, because I've never seen such a discrepancy where you're scoring consistently X and then Y. And what's crazier is the individual walked out of the test and didn't cancel, meaning that the individual thought, at least in some semblance, that she or he had done well enough to be able to get into the 160s range. That just goes to show the more you practice, the more you're going to be able to, as you said, I think before, have that 3-point margin of error where you're like, yeah, you know what? I'm kind of thinking I may get a 162. I may end up getting a 168. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll just land in the 165 range, right? So you really want to be kind of tuned into that. And that will really help you to kind of figure out whether you should cancel or not. And so in this instance, the individual, I think, had gone through she may have been a third year in school, had gone through school fast. And I said, look, pump the brakes, take a moment. There's no rush. Okay. And just do it right, apply, and kind of go through the motions in a way that allows you to have the best application possible, because you've got a great GPA and you're going to do yourself an incredible disservice. For me, I exhausted it, right? I spent 2 years studying for the LSAT. I must have taken 60 practice exams. I took test masters 3 times, and I still bombed it. There was no way out of it. So I had to put all my eggs into a fantastic application, which is then what was the genesis of my admissions company, because I realized you still have a hope through the admissions process in terms of the application process. Obviously, I had a good GPA from UCLA. I graduated summa cum laude, but still a 153 or 155, or I guess the average of 154 applying it to a top 10 law school was, I was standing a 6 to 10% chance of getting in, and I was able to get in.
Wow, that's really something, that the fact that your soft factors in the personal statement could have made such a difference in your application, other parts as well. So can you speak a little bit about the personal statement? What did you write yours about, or how did you construct it, or what do you advise your clients?
Sure. So if you guys are tuned in, listen very carefully, because this is a secret that we've been, I mean, it's not rocket science. I'm sure if I told Steve, he's not going to be like, oh, that's all new to me. I'm sure this is stuff that he's heard before and he's seen before. But just think of it this way. You have essentially 5 to 6 sections in a personal statement, right? This is the basic construct. The first is the introduction. You want to start it off with a bang. You've got 10 to 15 to 20,000 applicants applying to schools. You want to grab their attention. So you want to start it off with a quote, with an action, something that really is going to grab their attention. And the litmus test for that is, imagine you are filming your life, your movie. How does it start? What's the opening scene of your life, right? Is it going to be you riding a bicycle into the sunset? Is it going to be you studying? Is it going to be you having an argument? Is it you going to be, buying a house? What is it that's really going to get people excited? Then through that, you kind of provide implicitly context to what that action was and how it alludes to you wanting to go to law school. The second section is really about your background, who you are, give us the context of in law and why law even came on the radar. And you don't have to say, I love the law because. Never, ever use that. There's no reason to. A good written statement, it's all implicit. It's there for them to kind of figure out. It's not like in a movie, they say, he is the killer consistently throughout the movie. The movie proceeds and you figure it out, right? So the second paragraph is really about you and your life. If you're somebody who's like applying at the age of 21, 22, and you don't have a lot of professional experience, then you want to talk about your academic experience. You want to talk about your parents, your upbringing, what really kind of got you thinking about being an advocate. Section 3 is really about getting into the core, and that's the kind of crux paragraph. That's the pivot point. That's where you go from this is who I was and this is who I want to become, because the law is where I kind of want to go down that trajectory. So that is the really seminal pivot, kind of like the linchpin to the whole essay, is in that paragraph or section 3 that changes you from saying, and I was studying X and I realized I really want to go into Y because of this moment. And that moment should be taken back to the introduction. So the introduction, almost like a movie, starts with a gunshot. Somebody falls on the floor. We then pan back the scene to kind of the moment when they were both talking, right? And then we get back to that gunshot moment. And now we have context to it, right? Section 4 really kind of tells you about, well, given all of who I am, given what I've done, this is who, and this is why I want to go to law school, right? And this is why I want to pursue a legal career. And don't always say I want to be a lawyer. I much prefer to use the term legal advocate or advocate, because there's a whole range of stuff that doesn't necessarily fall into being branded as a lawyer, right? For example, for me, I practiced corporate law. I then did international development with the US government, traveling around the world doing development law. I then worked right now what I do is I help mentally and physically disabled people get their Social Security benefits. Yes, I'm in front of a judge. Yes, I'm arguing in front of him. Yes, I'm effectively a lawyer. But I've also done contract law. I've also given advice to people. So don't use that term lawyer. Use legal advocate or advocate. That's really described in Section 4. Section 5 is just basically telling them, listen, if you have a linkage or connection to that law school, put it there. If you went to UCLA undergrad, say, hey, this is my alma mater. I really want to go to UCLA for these reasons. And there's a whole list of reasons which we can talk about, or we can talk about it offline, about what things to include in that section that's really relevant to that school. And then finally, section 6, or the conclusion, brings the whole thing back full circle. And exactly kind of like a continuum, you want to kind of bridge it back together like a movie. You want that closure, right? Think about that beautiful kind of like arc, like you see in the movies. It reaches a crescendo and then comes back, and there's a resolution. So you want to bring a resolution to that and then reiterate, that you want to go into law. That is the whole thing for the personal statement. You can apply that same formula for the diversity statement, just changing the purpose and scope of what you're trying to achieve in both statements.
Wow. I love the movie analogy. Really captured my attention, at least, especially the murder, the gunshot, the criminal law here. But let's say, so let's apply to a specific example here. So can you talk about maybe a past client? You can obviously change the details, but a past client you worked with where they used this format for let's say their summer internship at a law firm, or they were a paralegal, or they're a political science major, or they did mock trial or debate.
Okay, so that's the means to an end, right? Those are things that they've done, but there's got to be a seminal reason that got them to do those things. It wasn't a coincidence that they got into mock trial debate in high school. It wasn't a coincidence that they worked at a law firm. So let's start it this way. Imagine one of the classic stories that I've worked with clients. And the way that we work with clients is we get into their brains, their minds, to kind of find out what is the underlying story. And sometimes it's very superficial. And that's when you know you didn't meet the authenticity test. It's not who they are. They're just feeding you something that's superficial enough to convince you, or they think they've convinced you. That's why they want to go to law school. But there's something more underlying. And in a lot of cases, what I've seen is students who've had parents who are successful. But at some point in their life, the parents faced bankruptcy. They faced some kind of major issue that they've had, right? And so I've kind of probed. I said, well, when they faced these issues, especially, let's say, during the economic crisis, what happened to them? Oh, well, our parents really kind of were up against it. How so? Well, they were facing bankruptcy. Why did they face bankruptcy? Well, I guess they really didn't follow the letter of the law, and their partner screwed them over. What happened there? Well, the partner basically took all the money and ran for the hills. And they didn't have any legal protections? They didn't. And how did that make you feel? It really drove me nuts, and drove my parents nuts. Interesting. And you felt like this kind of moral, imperative to kind of go back and do something about it? Yes, I did. And so what do you want to do with the legal field now that you've seen this happen to people who are maybe in immigrant communities that didn't have those, privileges for kind of legal advice because they didn't trust somebody, or they couldn't afford it, or they didn't even know that the law really support, right? Oh, I actually want to go into small business law. Bam, now we've got a storyline, right? So we started off with that crazy scene of when their parents were kind of hitting their heads and butting their heads because they just watched their whole lives and their businesses melt. And then we start building it into kind of how that affected them. And then we start building into the kind of classes they took, or the mock trial, or the debate, because they wanted to become advocates so they wouldn't see anybody else like them suffer in the same way. And then you finally bring that back full circle about small business law or some commercial law and so forth. And then you talk about the school. If they have an area of expertise in that area of law, then bam, you say, and I want to go to your school because you have the area of expertise of something I want to do. And then you bring it back full circle saying 10 years later, my parents have survived through this, but others have not. And then you kind of bring there. That's a classic story I've seen year in, year out, because it's happened so many times with people, especially in immigrant communities, that don't know the power of the law to really rescue them through tight situations.
Wow. And Hamada, what I really like about this is that you brought it from the parents to the applicant themselves. How did that make you, the applicant, feel? So it's not focusing too much on the parents. I find a lot of students, they want to get away from making it personal, and they just like to talk about other people instead.
Very, very, that's a really, really good point, Steve. Is there is a fine line between you saying, I love my mom and she's phenomenal, or my dad is a rock star, and next thing you know, 3/4 of the essay is talking about how amazing they are, and then tangentially talk about how it impacted you, and then you kind of bring it full circle and you close it off. No, this is a personal statement. It's personal to you, and it's a statement of what you have gone through. This is cathartic. If it doesn't give you goosebumps, if it doesn't make you cry, if it doesn't give you shocks, okay, then it's not good enough. And if it's not doing it to you, and you're the one who experienced it, you can bet it's not going to do that to the admissions committee. 15 years after I've written my personal statement, it still makes me feel like, wow, this was a phenomenal statement that still gives me goosebumps.
Love it. And so using the word I is okay.
Not to the point where you kind of beat it up, but there's good writing style where you don't have to use I as much, but you definitely can use it. I would say sparingly, but definitely use it. And don't freak out from using, or using we too much because you're trying to be too humble, or I too much where it becomes too self-centered and not about the greater experience, which is other people and so forth.
Right. One question I get a lot is, do you have to say in the personal statement why you want to become a lawyer or an advocate, as you said?
I think in a way, again, the best essays are implicit. But don't fear writing something like that, especially if it makes sense, right? I had another client whose parent was jailed. In his opinion, it was incorrectly jailed. They wanted to go and advocate for their parent. I mean, are you kidding me? How can you not? I mean, it's already implicitly stated there that they shadowed the lawyer that was protecting their father or trying to advocate for their father. They were frustrated that the father ended up being incarcerated. They want to go back, and they didn't even have to say it. It's already there. It's implicit. Then there's going to be those that are a little less implicit. But if you feel you have to include that statement in there, there's probably something fundamentally broken. That to the point you have to kind of beat it up, like, hey guys, just don't forget. And another thing we call it is the uniqueness test that we use at Right Track. If I erase the statement and I write on the statement Steve Schwartz and it still applies, that's not unique enough. It's not personal enough to you. If I change that statement and take out the word law and put in public policy and it still works, it's not personal enough to the law school program you're applying to. So you want to kind of think about that. And you don't want to just kind of do something where it can be, it has to be hit over the head. You have to build it into the statement, and it kind of slowly kind of filters into that direction.
And I would imagine that a service like yours, of course, would be able to help students who are struggling with managing how to modify that to be more unique, for example.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, our branding, our whole, the company slogan is discover your story, get admitted. Because after 11 years of doing this stuff, we realized that one of the most important parts of the application process is the story you tell. And there are quite a few copy editors out there that are phenomenal writers, but they're not admissions experts. They're not going to understand how to take a story, and you could get great screenwriters, but they're still not going to understand how to take a story in the setting of law school and help you understand what story will make sense with what wording that gets to that crescendo that really grabs the attention and becomes a memorable statement for the school. And that's definitely something we pay a lot of attention to for our clients, and saves them a lot of time. We often can work through a client's application within about 3 weeks to a month. I guarantee you, if you were doing it on your own and you're actually putting in the time, it should take you months and months and months of thinking and rethinking. It did for me. It took me June, July, August, September, October when I submitted my first applications. Now we figured out a way of doing it within very, very short period of time, within a couple of weeks, because we know exactly what questions to ask and how to drill in to the most vulnerable, personal parts of who you are. And it's an honor, and it's something that we hold very dear. We don't throw that aside. We don't underestimate the importance that we are given that secret from that student and are able to put it onto paper in a way that really allows them to stand out and become a unique candidate.
That's a really important point, that it's not just copy editing. It's not just moving commas around or dividing up run-on sentences. It's really about crafting a unique story about who the applicant is as an individual, tying it into why they want to be an advocate or a lawyer, and why, and putting it in the context of the entire application as well. Because there's the personal statement, the resume, the diversity statement, optional essays and addenda, character and fitness. Then there's also pulling in things about the LSAT and the GPA to make sure that it all makes sense and leaves no unanswered questions.
100%. And that's something that, almost as if you take out your whole application, spread it on the wall, and you should blur your eyes and see yourself. Every aspect of yourself. Even my addendum, as I said, I screwed up the LSAT 3 times, but I also screwed up the SAT 3 times. And I screwed up the GRE twice. I still got into Harvard with a full scholarship. I still went to UC Berkeley Law. I still went to University of Cambridge in England with a half scholarship. And I still graduated top of my class from UCLA and practiced law. I say it, I don't say it in vanity. I say it to you because I'm damn proud of the fact that these standardized tests are not necessarily indicative of how you're going to perform in life. But the point is, even when I wrote the addendum for that, I explained where I grew up. I had international education. I took the international baccalaureate. I screwed up the SAT 3 times. And I said there's a high degree of correlation, at least for me, between performing well in school and not performing well in my standardized testing. And then showed the examples of where that came. The schools appreciated it, right? Because A, it's classic legal argument. B, it actually showed the humility of, listen, I'm not great at it, but you give me a shot, I'm going to hit the ground running. And that's kind of what you want to do. Don't provide excuses. Provide explanations, show how you've learned from it, show how you want to move forward from it. And that's the important part. And that story for the addendum fit into the continuum of what I had in the diversity statement and the personal statement, and for most certainly in the catch-all, the resume.
That's a really important framework for any addendum, I think. Explaining rather than making excuses and keeping it really concise.
Exactly. No, you shouldn't be more than 300-400 words unless you want to divide up your addendum into into two or more parts. Maybe, like you mentioned, a poor GPA, which is a complete separate reason for a poor LSAT, which may be a complete separate reason for you taking time away from school, or having a medical issue, all the things, or a felony, or whatever else you need to explain in the addendum. But the addendum is mission critical. I've done tons and tons of videos on this, explain this to a lot of our clients. Do not underestimate the addendum in helping you. Even if you ended up with a 3.75 from undergrad, but you had 2 C's in that first semester, and it wasn't 2 C's because you were trying to understand, but it was 2 C's because you're helping a parent, write it in there. Some people will say, no, you already have a 3.75. Why would you bother? Because the point is, you learn from that experience that you're helping a parent, and that's why you didn't do well. And it was because of that you learned how to become a better student, so that at the end you ended up with a 3.75. They should know that.
I think that's important context.
They will never interview you, right, Steve? You'll never be interviewed for law school, with the exception, I believe, of Northwestern. That sucks. MBAs always get interviewed. Law students do not. So you have to put everything onto paper through all the different aspects of the application.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, unfortunately, law schools don't give interviews for the most part, with rare exceptions. So the application is that chance for you, the only chance to tell something about yourself and show them who you are.
Exactly.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the resume,
Okay.
which I think applicants have a lot of unanswered questions about how it should look. A lot of applicants, they've mainly crafted work resumes.
Got it.
And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how the application, your resume might be a bit different.
Yeah, let's use the term CV. Maybe it's too European. I mean, I studied in Europe and I've lived there. So in Europe, they use the word CV. I'd like to use that because resume really kind of connotes something that's going to be more on the professional side.
Sure.
And in terms of, let's say, an academic CV, what you're going to be looking for is talking more about some of the classes you took, classes that you did well in, publications, leadership activities, a huge emphasis on volunteer, any scholarships you've received, any skills that you have. That should be the emphasis of your law school resume, not necessarily just the professional experiences. Why? Because, Steve, you can go to law school at 22, even 21, maybe even 20. I have friends of mine that went in at 20 because they were savants. Or you can go to law school at what? I'm sure, Steve, 40, 50?
There's
60?
no limit. There's no limit.
There's
50,
no limit.
60, beyond.
Exactly. Unlike business school, where you pretty much have to have professional experience, and there's a certain sweet spot between the age of 24, let's say, and 28, 29, when a lot of business schools are going to be all over you, especially full-time. For law school, there isn't. So given that mechanism, you don't want to sit there and, you're going up against people that have zero professional experience, and yet they'll still get into Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, right? So the professional side is important, as you would say, and I'm probably going to screw this up. It's necessary, not sufficient. Did I get that right, Steve?
Yeah.
Good. Finally learned something from the LSAT. So those are the kind of things you want to focus on. Just to recap again, volunteer experiences, leadership experiences, some of the classes you took, the ones you got honors in, scholarships that you got, skills and interests that you can all put there in the resume. Again, providing a holistic view of who you are, not just the job and the professional experiences you have.
Love it. Fantastic. Thanks. So let's see, what else haven't we covered? The character and fitness you mentioned briefly as in the category of addendum. You mentioned the example of someone having a felony. What might they want to indicate in a character and fitness statement, specifically if it was, say, on the more common side, like a underage drinking violation or traffic tickets, things of that nature?
I mean, again, it's got to be explanations, not excuses, and it's got to be a lot of emphasis on the learning experience. I mean, I've had quite a few clients who've gotten, like you said, public intoxication, DUIs, and so forth. And you say, look, it was an error of judgment. I made a mistake. I did the community service required. I did not shirk from that responsibility. I have since joined and helped other students my age understand the repercussions of a DUI and so forth. And this is something that's very, very important to me. That's taught me a lot about A, the legal system, and B, about how to have stronger moral and ethical fitness. Now, you can imagine, Steve, when you're applying for the bar exam, you have a much, much more rigorous requirement for the moral character fitness. But by the same token, again, they do require, even for those who are applying to law school, because at the end of the day, they're trying to farm out lawyers and they want to nip it at the bud. They don't want to send out people that have a poor moral turpitude and so forth. So again, use explanations, not excuses, and talk about what you've learned from it, and be humble about it and be remorseful about it. That's what they want to see.
Really important. And short, 300 to 400 words, you said.
Max.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
And attach stuff to it. So, I mean, again, when I was doing my addendum, I attached my SAT scores. They didn't require it. If I have a medical condition, I would be attaching medical reports, or at least saying available upon request. Same with, anything else. Just always be very transparent and upfront and say, hey, I have all this information should you require it. So they know that you're not lying.
And you're also leaving no unanswered questions.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions here in the chat I thought we could dig into here. One of them is about employment options upon graduation.
Wow.
So, of course, someone going to a top 10, top 14 school, they're thinking about many opportunities available. Someone who goes to a lower ranked school, how does that typically affect employment opportunities? This person's very forward thinking.
Yeah, very forward thinking. That's a great question. So basically what I've found is those who go to lower tier law schools become some of the most entrepreneurial, enterprising. They're the ones that hustle the most. Like mad respect. In California, in Los Angeles, for example, those that end up at Southwestern Law School, or I think it's called Cal Western or something like that, another law school, a lot of them end up opening things like family law, bankruptcy, basic criminal law. Classic would be obviously personal injury, wills and trusts. All these are areas of law that you can either partner, go work for a small law firm, build up your acumen, build up your, cut your teeth on real legal work, and then move your way up until eventually opening your own practice, bringing other people together and so forth. So I think you become very enterprising, and it's definitely not the end of the road. In fact, you'll probably be making even more money than you would if you worked at a corporate law firm. And it's probably more gratifying because it's something that you're doing with clients that you can actually select or not select. Obviously, if you do very well in such a field, you can also end up being tapped to be a judge. There's quite a few judges that have gone to lower tier law schools because they've proven themselves over time that there can be outstanding professionals, legal professionals that eventually would be selected to be on the bench. Other areas of where you can apply your legal degree is obviously in non-traditional fields. Journalism, you can apply it in politics, you can apply it in business and entrepreneurship. It's a great degree to have. I know for me, I'm an entrepreneur right now, right? And similar to you, we're both entrepreneurs. I'm not necessarily using my legal degree in the day-to-day and running Right Track admissions, but it's allowed me to have a lot of credibility when I come to the table, right? But again, you're trying to shoot for the moon. A lot of questions people will ask, and I don't want to kind of deviate from there, is to say, listen, if I got into a school like Vanderbilt, right? What's Vanderbilt? Maybe top 25 at this point. And I got into UC Hastings, which I think is top 40 or maybe like somewhere there. Which school do I go to? Is it by ranking or not? In that case, you want to start thinking about where it's located. Vanderbilt's located in the middle of Tennessee. If you have no interest to practice in the Deep South, then probably UC Hastings better, especially because you're going to have a lot of opportunities in San Francisco. Judges, other lawyers, other practitioners who you can kind of, create that camaraderie as an alum. So you want to kind of think about that too in terms of ranking. And I can go on and on and on about that, but that's just one small snippet of it.
I really like what you said about entrepreneurship, because a lot of, more and more attorneys are, upon graduating, are opening their own practices, hanging out their own shingles, being solo practitioners. And so if you've got the hustle, necessity is the mother of invention, and going to a lower ranked school for a full ride could be well worth it if it gives you the opportunity to do whatever you want upon graduating. You
just have to be careful, because if you get into a lower tier law school, two things will happen. The competition's stiff, and they'll drop the bottom students. If you go to a top tier law school, that probably won't happen unless you really botch it up. But typically they could drop the bottom part of the students, because what they're trying to do is trying to have people that they can make sure will pass the bar. They don't want to have a lower bar rate, right? Second thing is you're not going to be practicing the sexy side of law. So you're going to be doing a lot of black letter law, because they're really trying to train you so you can pass that bar exam, because those schools really want somebody who will pass the bar. So it's not going to be the sexiest experience. It's going to be the funnest experience. For me at Berkeley, I had a hell of an experience because I was able to teach classes in the undergrad. I was able to take courses outside of the law school in the undergrad. I actually, as I said, I did a master's, so I was able to transfer credits from my master's program back to law school. So I had a really great experience. I was fortunate enough to get into that school, so I was able to do that. If you go to a lower tier law school, you're really up against it. It's all about grading. It's all about trying to stay on, keep your head above water. So you're trying to think about those kind of things as well. And that's why you should try to shoot for the moon and get the best scores you can to get into a best law school.
Those are some really important caveats. And I actually want to add one more to that, which is those conditional scholarships. Talking about dropping the bottom third of the class, there are some scholarships where they're based on how you perform in school. They might offer half the class a scholarship that says if you're in the top third of the class, you get to keep this, but obviously that's dooming a certain percentage to automatically fail. So you got to be really careful about the stipulations on that scholarship.
Very well said. Exactly right, Steve. And that would really be like, imagine you decide to go to Southwestern because of a full ride over Loyola Marymount, which didn't give you a full ride, and then you end up not doing well. Now you got stiffed with, costs. You've lost a year, even though it was, paid for supposedly, then you lost a scholarship, and now you're stuck. Do I continue law school at a lower tier law school without the scholarship that I should have otherwise taken, not taken, and ended up going to another better school? So 100% right.
So at the end of the day, it's about getting the best LSAT, best GPA, best application, all rolled together to give you the most opportunities possible.
Which is why you shouldn't shirk from the idea of taking a gap year 1 or 2 years so that you can give yourself the best shot possible to get into something that's going to essentially take up 3 years of your life and cost north of $200,000.
That's a great point. That gap year, you could work on your LSAT and you could work on crafting your application.
Exactly right.
Excellent. Well, I think that's as good a note to end it on as any. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you? You mentioned some videos as well.
Yeah, you can check out our YouTube station at Right Track Admissions. You can also check out our website, www.righttrackadmissions.com. We have blogs, a ton of blog articles on a whole litany of different things related to the admissions world. You can follow us on Facebook at Right Track Admissions LLC. You can follow us on Instagram, or just email us, info@righttrackadmissions.com. We provide free consultations for people to kind of place them in terms of figuring out where they are, where they're headed to. And we provide, as I said, everything you need to know about the law school process, from the basic applications all the way through to the finish line. And I do want to kind of throw in one more thing, that's something new that a lot of other companies don't do, and I think we've discovered something really important, is that we provide something called Law App, which is a law application preparation process. And what that does is essentially gives you a snapshot of where you stand right now when you come to us. So we do a SWOT analysis, we do an analysis of the schools you want to select, and we provide you with a high-level narrative, as well as kind of general mentorship for a period of like 3 weeks to a month, to tell you exactly where you stand so you can hit the ground running when you actually put together your application. And that's something important for people that are applying now. And that's also something for people who would decide to take the gap year, because we can tell you what you should be doing in that gap year to maximize your time. So when you do the application, you're not sitting there spinning your wheels and then you keep punting it off, and then you just keep using the LSAT as your crutch and saying, well, I'll just keep, studying for the LSAT, like I said, never moving from L to A or A to S, and then just constantly keep, procrastinating. You take it in January and then you never end up getting where you want to go. So that's a service that we've kind of created. We haven't seen any other company do it, and it's been very, very beneficial for a lot of our clients.
That sounds like a fantastic service. I love the idea of knowing where you stand the second you walk in, so that you know what you need to improve on.
Exactly.
Excellent. And folks can find me, Steve Schwartz. I'm on the LSAT blog. I have the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I'm also on Instagram. I also have a Facebook group. Tons of different ways to reach me. You could also email me personally as well if you have any questions at all on anything at all related to the LSAT.
Fantastic, Steve. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for having me on board. This has really been an honor. And again, I want to plug Steve's work. The fact that he's already been thinking about doing all this material and providing you with such different ways to actually study, I can tell you now, is exactly what you should be thinking about: finding those tools, using those tools, and maximizing your score with somebody like him. So again, thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you, Hamada, all the great advice you shared, especially the framework for the personal statement. I loved that idea as well.
Fantastic.
I encourage folks to check you out and take advantage of the free consultation.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.